Tonight, we're looking at a story that is quietly turning into one of the most uncomfortable political moments inside Donald Trump's inner circle. And at the center of it all is a luxury mansion in Florida. Now, on the surface, it might sound like just another political controversy. Washington has seen plenty of those over the years. But according to several reports and political insiders, what investigators reportedly discovered connected to that property is beginning to trigger serious concern among some of Trump's closest allies. Because the story doesn't simply involve a house. It involves money, relationships, political loyalty, and a paper trail that some people in Washington may not want examined too closely. And if the reports circulating this week are accurate, the fallout from this situation could reach far beyond just one property owner. But before we get to that part of the story, it's important to understand how this situation began. For years, Pam Bondi has been one of Donald Trump's most loyal political allies. The former Florida Attorney General built a reputation inside Republican circles as a reliable defender of Trump during some of the most intense political battles of the last decade. She appeared frequently on television. She spoke at major political events, and she often served as one of the most visible voices defending Trump's positions during moments of controversy. Inside Trump's political network, loyalty like that is highly valued. But in Washington, loyalty can also bring scrutiny. Because whenever political figures become closely connected, investigators, journalists, and political opponents inevitably start asking questions. And in this case, those questions appear to have focused on something surprisingly specific: a mansion. A large, luxury property in Florida that recently began attracting attention after new details about its financial history started circulating among reporters and political analysts. At first, very few people paid attention to the story. Luxury real estate deals involving political figures are not unusual. Florida, after all, has become something of a second capital for American politics in recent years. But then a few small details started raising eyebrows. According to individuals familiar with early reporting on the situation, certain financial records connected to the property appeared unusual. Numbers that didn't quite match expectations, transactions that some analysts described as curious, and ownership structures that raised additional questions about how the property may have been financed. Now, to be clear, none of these details by themselves necessarily prove wrongdoing. Political figures purchase expensive homes all the time, but in Washington, perception can be just as powerful as proof. And once the story began circulating inside political media circles, the reaction was immediate. Journalists started digging deeper. Political strategists began asking quiet questions. And inside Trump's network of advisors and allies, concern reportedly started spreading that this situation could evolve into something much larger. Because if investigators or journalists continue following the financial trail connected to that mansion, they might eventually start examining relationships connected to it. Relationships that extend into one of the most powerful political networks in the country. And that possibility is what reportedly has some people in Washington extremely nervous right now. As the story began gaining attention, reporters started looking more closely at the financial background connected to the property. And according to several sources familiar with the early reporting, the first thing that caught investigators' attention was timing. The purchase history of the mansion appeared to overlap with several politically significant moments during the last decade. Moments when major financial donations, political campaigns, and legal battles were all unfolding at the same time. Now again, timing alone doesn't necessarily mean anything improper occurred, but investigators often begin by examining timelines, and when multiple events appear to overlap, that's usually when reporters start asking deeper questions. Questions about where money originated. Questions about how certain properties were financed, and sometimes, questions about whether financial decisions were connected to political relationships. At first, this investigation seemed like it might remain relatively small, another minor controversy in the constant stream of political stories that move through Washington every week. But then something unexpected happened. The story started circulating inside Trump's political network itself. According to individuals familiar with discussions happening behind the scenes, some advisors began privately expressing concern that the Manchin story could quickly grow into a much larger political problem if additional details emerge. Because once reporters begin investigating financial records, the story rarely stays limited to one document. More documents appear, more people become involved, and sometimes entirely new connections begin to surface. That possibility appears to be exactly what some figures inside Trump's circle are worried about right now. Political strategists know that financial investigations often evolve in unpredictable ways. What begins as a simple question about a property transaction can sometimes turn into a much broader inquiry into financial relationships and political influence. And with the 2024 political landscape still shaping the future of American politics, even small controversies can quickly become major national stories. But here's where the situation becomes even more complicated. Because according to several political analysts following the situation closely, the Manchin itself may not be the real issue. Instead, the real concern could involve what the financial records connected to the property might eventually reveal about the network of political relationships surrounding it. And that's the part of the story that reportedly has several individuals inside Trump's orbit paying very close attention right now. Because if additional information begins to emerge, the political consequences could extend far beyond a single real estate transaction. It could open a window into how influence, loyalty, and financial relationships operate inside one of the most powerful political movements in the country. And in Washington, once a story reaches that point, it rarely stays quiet for long. As more attention began focusing on the Manchin story, something interesting reportedly started happening behind the scenes. Inside Washington, political stories usually move in predictable ways. First, journalists begin asking questions. Then, political strategists start preparing responses. But sometimes, the most revealing signals don't come from official statements. They come from silence. And according to several political reporters following the situation, that silence is exactly what started raising concern inside Trump's political orbit. Normally, when a controversy emerges involving one of Trump's close allies, responses come quickly. Statements are issued. Allies appear on television. Supporters dismiss the story as politically motivated. But in this case, the early reaction from several prominent figures inside Trump's circle was noticeably restrained. Instead of aggressively pushing back, some advisors reportedly chose to wait and see how the story would develop. That decision alone caught the attention of political analysts, because waiting can sometimes indicate something important. It can mean that those involved are still trying to understand what information might emerge next. And that's exactly the kind of situation that can create quiet panic inside political networks. According to individuals familiar with internal discussions, some strategists began privately expressing concern that if journalists continue examining financial records connected to the property, additional names could eventually appear. Names connected not just to the property itself, but to the broader political network surrounding it. And in Washington, that kind of uncertainty can be dangerous. Because once a story begins expanding beyond a single individual, it can quickly become something much bigger. What started as a real estate question could potentially evolve into a broader political narrative about influence, loyalty, and financial relationships inside a powerful political movement. And that's precisely the kind of storyline political advisors try to prevent from gaining momentum, especially during periods when national political tensions are already high. But there's another reason this situation may be causing concern. Because the current political climate in the United States has become extremely sensitive to questions involving money, influence, and transparency. Over the past decade, voters across the political spectrum have become increasingly skeptical about how political figures manage their financial relationships. Every major political party has faced controversies involving donors, financial disclosures, and real estate deals. And that means even relatively small financial questions can quickly become amplified in the media. Political opponents begin asking questions, television networks begin hosting debates, and social media quickly transforms complicated financial discussions into simplified narratives that spread rapidly. Inside Trump's circle, many advisors are well aware of how quickly these situations can escalate. They've seen it happen before. And that experience may be exactly why some individuals are reportedly watching the mansion story very carefully. Because once political momentum begins building around a controversy, controlling the narrative becomes extremely difficult, especially if new information continues emerging piece by piece. But according to several analysts tracking the situation, the most important development may not actually involve the mansion itself. Instead, it may involve what the story represents. Because when journalists begin examining financial records connected to political figures, they rarely stop at a single property. They start mapping connections between individuals, connections between financial transactions, connections between political relationships. And once those connections start forming a larger picture, the story can take on an entirely new dimension. In this case, several reporters have reportedly begun asking a broader question, not just how the mansion was purchased, but whether the financial network surrounding the property intersects with other political activities that have taken place over the past several years. Now again, at this stage, many of these questions remain exactly that, questions. There has been no official finding of wrongdoing connected to the property, but in Washington, the process of asking questions can sometimes be just as powerful as the answers themselves, because the moment a story enters the political conversation, it begins influencing public perception. And perception is often what shapes political outcomes. That's why several political strategists are reportedly watching very closely to see whether this story continues expanding or quietly fades away. If journalists uncover additional financial details, the situation could quickly become a larger political issue. Opponents would likely demand investigations. Congressional committees could begin requesting documents, and the story could dominate political media coverage for weeks or even months. But there is also another possibility. The story may remain relatively contained. Financial records may ultimately show nothing unusual, and the controversy could slowly disappear as new political headlines take over the news cycle. Right now, it's simply too early to know which direction the situation will take. But what is clear is that the story has already triggered serious attention inside Washington's political ecosystem. Reporters are watching. Political advisors are monitoring developments. And inside Trump's circle, several individuals are reportedly hoping that whatever information may exist connected to the mansion has already been fully revealed. Because if additional details begin emerging in the coming weeks, the political consequences could extend much further than anyone initially expected. At this point, the story surrounding the Florida mansion has reached a moment that often determines whether a political controversy grows or quietly disappears. Because in Washington, there are really only two directions a situation like this can go. Either new information continues to surface, or the story fades as the news cycle moves on to something else. But for the people involved, those two outcomes can mean very different futures. Political careers have survived far worse controversies than a real estate investigation. And at the same time, some of the biggest political scandals in American history started with questions that initially seemed very small. A single financial transaction, a document that didn't quite match expectations, or a relationship that raised just enough curiosity for reporters to keep digging. Right now, the mansion story appears to be sitting at that exact crossroads. Several journalists are reportedly continuing to examine financial records connected to the property. Political analysts are watching closely to see whether additional names or financial links emerge. And inside Washington's media environment, stories like this often follow a familiar pattern. At first, only a few reporters pay attention. Then a larger outlet begins covering the story. Soon after that, television networks start discussing the potential political impact. And before long, what started as a quiet investigation becomes a national political conversation. Whether that will happen here remains uncertain. But what we do know is that the current political moment in America has made financial transparency a highly sensitive issue. Voters from both parties have become increasingly skeptical about the financial relationships surrounding political leaders. Questions about money, influence, and access now receive far more attention than they did even a decade ago. And that means stories involving financial records can quickly take on a life of their own, especially when they involve individuals closely connected to powerful political figures. For Donald Trump's political network, loyalty has always been one of the most defining characteristics of his movement. Many of his closest allies have defended him through years of intense political battles, legal challenges, and media scrutiny. Pam Bondi has long been considered part of that loyal inner circle, which is why any story connected to her inevitably draws attention from journalists looking for a broader political narrative. But the truth is, at least for now, many of the questions surrounding the mansion remain unanswered. Investigations take time. Financial records often require months of analysis, and sometimes the final conclusions look very different from the early speculation that surrounded the story. In Washington, patience can be one of the most valuable tools in politics, because political storms often rise quickly, but they can also disappear just as fast. What determines the difference is usually one thing: evidence. If additional documentation begins emerging that connects the property to a larger financial pattern, the story could grow significantly. If not, it may eventually become just another brief moment in the endless cycle of American political drama. For now, reporters will continue asking questions. Political advisors will continue monitoring developments, and the people closest to the situation will likely be hoping that the information already available tells the complete story. Because if something new appears, another document, another transaction, another unexpected connection, the political consequences could move very quickly. And in Washington, when momentum begins building around a story, controlling the outcome becomes nearly impossible. But perhaps the most important question is not about one mansion or one political figure. It's about the larger system that surrounds American politics, a system where financial relationships, political loyalty, and public perception constantly collide. A system where even a single document can trigger weeks of national debate, and a system where voters ultimately decide which stories matter and which ones fade away. For now, the mansion story remains unfinished. More reporting may emerge, or the story may slowly disappear as the political spotlight moves elsewhere. But one thing is certain: in Washington, the quiet stories are often the ones that become the loudest later. And many people inside the political world will be watching closely to see which path this story takes next. So the real question now is this: is the mansion story simply another short-lived political controversy, or is it the beginning of something much bigger that hasn't fully revealed itself yet? Let me know what you think.